Hi, and welcome back to Continual Fandom. I'm going to be your host, Jim Nettles, and tonight we are talking about The Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan's grand epic that, of course, Brandon Sanderson has picked up upon. And before we start taking our trip starting out the Two Rivers, let's see who else has joined us for this grand epic. So, Paige, you are up first.
Okay. Hi, I'm Paige L. Christie. I'm an author of epic fantasy. You can see some of the books behind me. And I fell into the Wheel of Time through the books and through the JordanCon convention and friends who are obsessed with it. And I've been hanging out there for quite a while. So excited to be here.
Sargon.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. My name is Sargon Donabed. I am a writer of a variety of things, predominantly academic, which is my wonderful day job. And I got started Wheel of Time going, well, after reading and then going to JordanCon about 7 or 8 years ago was my first sort of introduction to the fandom. So happy to be here.
Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard Fife, author of Conflict Born, a Gaslamp fantasy. I've been reading The Wheel of Time since late 90s when I got about halfway through book one, and then dropped it until early aughts, and spam read all the way through book 10, and been going to JordanCon since it started. I help run it, so it's got its hooks in me.
And Michael.
Yeah, I'm a professor at the Citadel, where I teach medieval things, and I write a lot of academic books, but I also write fiction, Shards of Heaven series from Tor, a current trilogy from Audible. But probably most pertinent here is I have a book coming out this November, an authorized book by the Jordan Estate, The Origins of the Wheel of Time, which is looking at the background, the notes, and where everything came from. So I'm imagining that's kind of why I'm here. Yay.
And welcome. So I want to get a little bit of a start, because we are talking fandom here, a little bit of how did you really first get pulled into it? What spoke to you about the series? I mean, I started reading it early 90s, somewhere in that, time frame as well. So Paige, how about you? What sucked you in? What pulled you into the universe?
Well, that's a tough one. I think initially the complexity. I like complex stories. I like complex world. I like characters that come from different directions and not everybody's one dimensional. And that really stood out for me. I also really appreciated at the time, it was pretty groundbreaking in the way it handled female characters and female power. And so that was really interesting to me, where I hadn't seen a lot of that when I first started reading it. I mean, there's been a lot more of that since, but it was kind of unique coming from a male writer to see that kind of thing in its time. And so that's kind of how I found my way in.
Sargon, how about you? What pulled you in initially?
So I'm gonna have to. Do I have to? I have to bust a Tolkien. Toss a Tolkien in here. Can I say bust a Tolkien? So escape, consolation, and recovery. I'm gonna go on fairy stories here, and sorry, did I do that well enough, Michael? So I think I feel like as much as I overanalyze at times, from the academic perspective, like Michael, just being in the academic world and being a professor, that tends to occur very frequently, especially when you teach students to utilize critical thinking and analysis. I didn't want to do any of that when I was reading fantasy. I simply wanted to do those things, or be taken or be allowed to do the things that Tolkien talked about on fairy stories. And that's what it did for me. That's what Wheel of Time did for me in various places in my life when I was reading the text. So I don't know. I think I was probably not reading Steinbeck when I was in high school, and rather reading fantasy novels. And at some point is when I picked up sorry for the Steinbeck fans, but when I picked up Wheel of Time, and then I kept going, and frequently got yelled at by my English teacher for reading fantasy when I should have been reading Steinbeck and Great Expectations and stuff like that. I don't know what the hell if I answered a question or not, but anyway, I'm going to stop
Hey,
there.
this is your story. I mean, Richard, how about you?
First time I tried was just because a friend had said, "Hey, you should read this book." At the time, I was reading Sword of Truth, and my friend said, "This is better." And I only got halfway through it. But then when I picked it back up, it was at a time that I was both working really hard on starting my own journey as a writer, and I also was in a very bad roommate situation where I was trying to get away. Yeah, my roommate and I just did not get along, and so I would go to the closest borders, and I would sit down with a cup of tea and I'd just be reading a book, just have some peace away from that roommate. And so I'd just sit down and read The Wheel of Time in the Borders cafe. And every time I finished one, I just go over to the shelf and buy the next one. So it got me through a tough time in my life there for just the escapism.
And being that there's about 100 books in the series, that bought you plenty of time.
Yeah. I drank a lot of tea.
Michael, how about you?
So it's actually interesting hearing how other people approached it. I first found it when I was in middle school. The books had just come out. I'm sure maybe people have heard the story about me going on my dirt bike and buying such a thing in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I came to it as a fantasy reader, as a Tolkien fanatic, I guess you'd say. I'd really cut my teeth on that. And it was that escapism. But what hooked me was that even from that first reading in middle school, as I started reading Eye of the World, how kind of immediately you could see that there was something going on behind the traditional fantasy text, where you could see the vestiges of the fact that he was working with historical and mythological materials. Even on those first pages, with the gates of Paradisen, I'm like, that's the gates of paradise. Hey, what, you're up to something, pal. And I really kind of got fixated on that very quickly, but also had that level of escapism and just fun. It's not just kind of like an Umberto Eco text or something like that, which is like, oh, it's got some really cool thought stuff, but not so much on the fun. Jordan had both. And that captivated me early on, and it enabled me to grow with the books, where I was still enjoying those stories. I was still, what's Rand going to do next, right? What's going to happen? But all along being able to appreciate and hopefully as I grew older and more knowledgeable, appreciating what was going on behind the text. So I just found it a very unique kind of construction, a methodology that he was using. Even when I could only kind of hint that it was there, I could sense it, but couldn't understand it. I thought it was interesting, and that feeling's never really left me. I mean, here I am still doing it.
Yeah, I do think I also really liked in the early chapters where Tom does the whole thing with all the legends of the prior ages, and you're even if you're not completely piecing together what each one is, it's like there's something there that's ringing that it's like, wait, what? Why are these familiar?
Well, and there's something to be said for a story that can speak to you at different stages in your life. That a writer has done something well, even if certain things don't age well. If the overall arc of the story is still relatable, or there's different things you pick up on at different times in your life, that the writer has done their job well and worked in many, many layers. And you don't find a lot of writers who are good at that. I could think of a few, but Jordan is definitely one.
Well, so, Michael, when did you go from thinking of the kids as being in the right versus Moraine being in the right when she's spirited? When did you feel that shift of, dang kids, just listen to her?
I felt that way early on. I don't know if it was where my parents raised me or something. I'm like, would you just listen to the adults in the room? Like, they know what's good for you. early on I felt that, but I also enjoyed almost the vicariousness as initial reader of these of these kids aren't listening and things are working out well at the beginning. I'm like, that's phenomenal. That wouldn't work if I didn't listen to my parents. That's fun. But yeah, my heart was with Moraine pretty early on. I was like, I like her. You know, she knows what she's doing. I would have followed her. I'd been like, yeah, where are we going? Yeah, I'm going. All right, cool. Land's coming. Awesome.
Let's make a party. Oh, wait. So, you know, kind of starting, I mean, there's, you know, we've already definitely hinted at this, you know, Tolkien was definitively in the background of all of this. I mean, there's no way of saying that the influences were definitively there. I mean, like it is on pretty much anything in fantasy and high fantasy. But when you start looking at then how it diverges, I mean, again, the premise behind Wheel of Time is all about the fact of it's the earth of the past, present, and future, even if you don't really talk about it that way. But I mean, this kind of goes to the hints you were talking about seeing, oh, okay, well, I know what this is. I know what this is. There's a much stronger level of familiarity, I think, than looking necessarily like at Middle Earth. You know, so Sargon, I'm going to pick on you for this one. You know, for you, when you look at this and you compare this, say, to Tolkien and everything else, where does it start to really diverge for you? And what are the aspects of this where you actually prefer? Not that I'm going to say which one is your favorite, but we are here talking about Wheel of Time. So, you know, what are the aspects that kind of take the Wheel of Time series and allow it to grow from the seeds that Tolkien, you know, grew and planted?
Oh, that's okay. That's a tough one, Jim. So I also have to be a bit careful because I've I've had conversations and read enough from certain authors who definitely don't feel that Tolkien had influenced them. If anyone's ever heard Stephen Erickson talk about this, he gets a little bit frustrated at times where there's an assumptive, you know, everyone's basing at least their archetypal ideas on Tolkien, right? Which arguably is not always the case. I mean, I could say that's not necessarily the piece that is so overwhelmingly important to me. I think Tolkien's vision is what was so important, is that, you know, the sense that he understood the importance of fantasy, of fairy tale, of fairy stories from the get-go, the necessity of having them in human life, right? The idea that humans need myth, right? This is simply who and what we are. And I think that, to me, you know, again, the archetypal pieces, like, you know, was this character borrowed from this person, from that ancient myth? Sure, you know, that ancient culture, sure. There are those commonalities. There's no doubt about that. In a lot of fantasy, you definitely see Tolkien's influence in the Wheel of Time in a lot of different ways. But I, you know, it's difficult for me not to see Arthur Hawkwing connected to, you know, King Arthur, connected to Aragorn, connected to, right? I mean, that stuff is not super strange, and I'm not saying that's always the case, but we make those, I think, relationships, or we relate them very easily. What I think is really important is something that Paige had mentioned too. So first and foremost, we have this idea of that escape, and again, you know, like Tolkien did mention in his writing, I don't mean escape as in escapism as to run away from something, right? Like, just I'm throwing this away, I'm leaving, but escape rather, and he explains this in his work, you know, escape rather like from a prison. So when you feel like you're, you know, if you're in a prison and you know, what do you need to do? You need to get out of that prison. I think what allowed, or let's say what allows people like Robert Jordan and Tolkien to write so well is that they tapped into something that was very quintessentially human. And many fantasy authors can do this, but you know, where they diverge, because there's a lot, as I said, a lot of similarities between the two, but I think where they maybe partly diverge, for me, is simply the issues of modernity that come into it. And what I mean by modernity is also something as simple as language, right? People tend to forget that just the way in which it was written, the time period in which it was written, gives a different feel to it. I mean, it's language is like texture, like sandpaper has various what's the word I'm looking for?
Grades.
Yeah, the various grades of fantasy fantasy. Wow, grades of sandpaper. So in many cases, there, you rub one and you think, okay, this is very coarse, and then one's a little bit finer. Language is like that, and so I'll be honest. I mean, something as simple as it was tougher for me to connect with the written Tolkien at times because the language was so distinct from what I would connect with as a person growing up in the time that I was. And I'm a '90s kid. To me, the '90s are fantastic. Yeah, sorry. I mean, like late '80s, '90s, man. That was like, that's a time period. So, Wheel of Time, the late '80s, early '90s, it starts to move forward. So just something as simple as language, I think, and again, that's not this amazing, wow, this totally makes Tolkien, or makes Jordan so much better than Tolkien. That's not what I'm saying at all, but just simply it allowed me to connect with it in a way that at some point, at least that point in my time in my life when I was younger, it was more difficult for me to get into the written word of Tolkien, I would say. And that was just me. But I mean, there are so many similarities and differences. I don't want to go on, but that to me, the language, the texture of the language, I think was a big distinction for me.
How about you, Richard? If you're looking, because I mean, again, I think like you mentioned, all fantasy goes and pulls from a lot of the mythic elements. That's part of what gives it its strength and makes it relatable for all of us. But Richard, what about you?
Well, first, to make Sargon smile, everyone's ripping off Gilgamesh. But for me, I felt there was a comfort for me when I was reading Eye of the World in the clueless farm kids being whisked off on an adventure, and a lot of walking and a lot of just epic fantasy. Let's see the vistas. Oh, you think Barrowland's a city? That's nothing. And then Camelin.
So Star Wars.
Yeah, there's a bit of that Star Wars of just getting to go on space opera, but in medieval times. The divergence I felt it when they just had the sudden jerk of we're going to the White Tower, and then nope, we're going up to the Eye of the World, and everything just jerked. And that was kind of the first spot that I felt that it was just taking, like, it eased us in with this very familiar hobbits leaving the Shire feel, and then it jerked us more into a wider world. And then then it still, I think, kept to some of the tropes until about book 4, because there's the expansion and contraction that happened in each book. All the mains ended back up together at the end of book 1, 2, and 3. But then in book 4, everyone scatters, and never again will all the mains be in the same spot. And for me, that's why I think book 4 is the best. It's where it just finally completely spread its wings and became something new.
Michael, how about you?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's meant to be Tolkien at the beginning. I mean, what Sargon and Richard are both saying is spot on. I mean, this was very intentional. It's very clear from the materials that are left behind. It's very clear what's kind of going on, structurally. It's very intentional. That sort of jerking feeling that Rich was describing. Yep, that's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to have this, like, oh, we're not doing that. And it is, I think, important to recognize that this is not some sort of error. That this is not, wow, I caught the fact that Jordan was kind of using these Tolkien things, like he deliberately did that and kind of expected people to recognize that. That's not a gotcha. It's not a bug. It's a feature. And of course, the feature is I'm gonna start you with this thing that's familiar, and move you into the unfamiliar. And you see bits of it early on, right? Gandalf's a woman now. What just happened there? That's interesting. I mean, I always kind of wonder about Gandalf, but okay. That's a curveball, and then you slowly build these elements until you get the big shift. And what it is they're both working with the same kind of framing relative to history and myth. It's just simply that you have Jordan doing this a little bit further down the road, and the world has changed. From language to social interactions, things have changed, and Jordan's trying to reflect and incorporate that. And I think that's amazing. Like, I think that's incredible. I mean, I'm someone who publishes on Tolkien, and I teach classes on Tolkien. I love Tolkien, and I love Jordan. Like, and that's okay, and that's like kind of fun. I think. I mean, I think it enriches both authors. It enriches backwards in the sense that wow, this is a testament to what Tolkien had done, and then I think it enriches our understanding of Jordan, recognizing the ways that he's using Tolkien. And as I said, at a pretty kind of like fundamental level, which is probably all the details I can give on that.
All the details?
All the details. So there's this letter that's no.
So Paige, how about you?
Well, I mean, it's quite clear the instant you start reading The Eye of the World that it is a love letter to the Lord of the Rings. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, as a writer, you start writing for a reason, and you start writing because you fall in love with someone else's story, and that never leaves you. And so it was quite clear to me, at least, that Jordan was in love with the Lord of the Rings at some level and wanted to. It's like an homage almost to it. But then there comes a point. I mean, okay, so Lord of the Rings is a quest to throw something away. Okay, you're not going to find something. It's a quest to throw something away. And at a certain point, if you're going to create your own story, you got to stop before you throw it away, and you got to take off in your own direction. And so for me, I could appreciate very quickly what Eye of the World was, but what Michael said is true. The instant that Gandalf was a woman, that's when I knew we were going to diverge. Because, I mean, okay, number one, I always, and people are going to hate me for this, but I always thought that Gandalf, for a wizard, didn't do much. So, sorry. But, yeah. Okay, so then you got Moraine, who's hurling fireballs and various things. Oh, she's getting it done. Okay, so there was difference there already. There was difference from the get-go. And so recognizing the influence is different than going, okay, this is the same story again, because there are very clear hints right from the very beginning that this is going to go somewhere different. And so I think maybe as a woman reader, I saw that difference pretty early on in the first book, because that was unexpected for me. And I'll be honest, neither of these two epics are my favorite epic. My favorite epic is written by a woman, as far as big, long series. But it was an idea that, to me, that a big, long series could have powerful women in it, and it was very clear from the get-go. So that's where the happened for me, was very, very early on in the first book.
Yeah,
what's the series?
The Wars of Light and Shadow by Janie Wirtz.
That's awesome. I was just say, look, I love that you said kind of a love letter to Tolkien. I think I can. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I can say this. One of the early bits of writing that Jordan did when he was first beginning to kind of scope all this out is actually sort of like a study in trying to figure out how Tolkien made names for things. He was simply trying to get at a basic level, right? How does Tolkien? I get a feel of the world through nomenclature, through the names of things. How is it that Tolkien was doing that? So how can I kind of like reconfigure that for myself? I mean, and it's a clear, sort of one artist looking at how another artist does something, right? I always liken this when I'm talking about other things to my students, if you want to be a magician, go to a magic show and don't watch as a member of the audience, watch as a magician, right? You're trying to figure out how did they do that, right? Not just be wowed by it. And it's clear Jordan was in fact doing that with Tolkien, trying to see how did he do that. So good job. Like it.
Well, and that kind of goes to the next place I want to go, which is to talk about the language. We've kind of hit on it some, talking about the fact of, this was much more about the language of the 90s. It is much more contemporary language. But the thing to me that one of the things that grabbed me earliest on and gives a lot of those hints was exactly that: how things got named, what things got named, what things felt just familiar enough, what things gave a hint as to what the underlying pieces might be. So, so Richard, from your perspective, how much of an effect did the language itself have on you? I mean, as you were going through the stories, because we all know there's a difference between what I read that hooks me, pulls me in, draws me in, and becomes fundamental and really makes an impression on me, versus the story of, okay, I blew through that, let me go to the next book.
Yeah, I think that it was written with more contemporary language. It's written in the voice of authors of the 90s, and as Sargon said, there's spots where Tolkien's language prose is beautiful, but it's also from the 1920s, 30s. It doesn't flow through my head. It has to go through a filter in my head in a way that the Wheel of Time didn't. And future generations are probably going to feel that way about the Wheel of Time as language continues to shift, because it's a moving target. But I think one thing that really did stand out to me in the days when I was, every evening was spent at the cafe reading, was I was picking up character names, and I was just picking up I noticed Rand L. Thor. I noticed Tom Marilyn. And I loved how in book 4 he makes the joke about maybe he was going to be the one throwing fireballs in the future stories, since he's his name becomes Merlin. And there's stuff that I didn't realize until 3 or 4 rereads. But part of it has been that the language does a great job of being both accessible and also deep. I think there's stuff that's hidden inside there that once you've done an initial read through and you know what's coming, you can pay a little more attention to things like Tar-Valon is Avalon, that Egwene Alver is Guinevere, stuff like that just really made me keep coming back, I think, because it always felt like there was another secret to uncover.
So speaking of secrets to uncover, so Michael.
Tell us the truth, Michael.
Nice segue, man. Nice segue. Well played. Yes. What are the secrets?
Language. And how did the language really come and really impact you? How did that really come and really speak to you? The things that the layers you picked up out of the language itself.
Yeah, the language is an art, and what it has been amazing. There's what 14 million words or something like that in the main series. The notes are way more than that. There's way more materials that nobody's seeing, and a lot of it is. There's a lot of just notes, but there's a lot of drafts. And what is fascinating is, to me at least, is seeing. Just reading like a single passage through drafting, right? And seeing, okay, this is kind of how he initially wrote that, and seeing the process getting that to the final product, which is the thing that I kind of love, right? Is the final product. And I was just thinking, I read back in the day or whenever, and then seeing, oh, he started there. Oh, how interesting to see the layers being put in place. And some of it is the layering of, well, I'm working with this illusion, and I want to get that, that kind of subtle hint, right? How far is too far of a hint, right? It's not a fun game if it's obvious, and but at the same time, you need it to be obvious that there's a game. I mean, and I'm not meaning to demean the Wheel of Time by calling it a game or something like that, right? But there's he wants readers to understand there's another level of the text, and he wants you to see that, but then doesn't want it to be like, well, it's all very obvious what it is. So there's a level of kind of getting the balance right that he's working with. And then there's just a level of the beauty of the text, of trying to, get the right phrasing in. And much of that is his very like deep commitment and drive, where you're looking at 30 drafts or something before we get something like, the finished product. I mean, it's just going over and over and over and over. And then of course Harriet is coming along. You can't sort of talk about these books without talking about the influence of Harriet, who is there as well, helping to get polish on this. And after a while, you can see that he's ingested these lessons so much that he's almost, oh, Harriet's going to make me fix it this way. Like he understands like a good kind of student does, right? I mean, Sargon knows this feeling. My job is to make myself not have a job for these students, right? The glory of it is next year there's going to be another crop of kids who's going to come in, and who needs that lesson? And the same thing was happening with him as he learned these lessons. Actually, in the book that's coming out, I give a couple of scenes where here's the first draft. This is what that first looked like. Here you go. Here's what the final scene looks like. Pretty different in some cases. Like, wow, that would have been interesting if that happened in the plot. But also seeing how much better he got at developing characters and getting that vision to us in a way that is easy to understand, as you all were saying, but also conveys the depth of character, sociology, everything that he's trying to get and make it have this meaning that imparts but gives the weight of legend that the whole thing is supposed to be doing. So I find the entire process fascinating. Sorry, I geek out about this because as a writer, I'm just like, my God, I'm getting to see the magician figure out how to do the trick, and it is cool to see his own development through that.
Well,
So,
and let me
yeah,
ask
I love it.
Let me ask a question on that, because it's actually what triggered the idea of the question. Speaking about the game, knowing that you're stepping into, in essence, there is a deeper game that's being played here in the text. Is the fact that that the subtext is written that well and so well not indicative of the game that's being played through the story as a whole? Because that's what I actually grabbed me early on, is that sensation of, if you watch the underlying game, that will tell you the top level game is being played.
Yes, I mean, in the sense that the trying to think how to phrase it. I have to be really careful about how I phrase certain things now, because I don't want people to think like I'm speaking for like this is the final answer, like things are canon if they come out of my mouth or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I do think there's a degree to which understanding all the layers of the cake is the only way you can get the flavor of the whole damn cake, right? If you're just having the icing's good. The icing's good. But my friend, if you get the whole cake, you're really going to understand what's going on here. So I do think it is, you best appreciate it to get the whole thing.
All right, we'll let you escape off the hook this time for a minute. So Paige, how about you? What about the language?
Well, we're talking about the games that are played with the words and the names and the place names and the rhythm of the story and the patterns of the story and the archetypes. Part of the game, I mean, we're all writers. All of us in this space right now are writers. And if you're not enjoying the game yourself and the language yourself and the words yourself as a writer, that's going to come through when you are, because plot and slogging, your reader's going to know. So when you're, as a writer, and I think this is very obvious that this was true for Jordan, when as a writer, you're enjoying playing things out and then replaying them and playing them again and finding that right fit. When the game on the back end is entertaining to you as the writer, that comes through in the language. And it may take you 4 or 5 times to entertain yourself and find that rhythm. And when you do, you know it. And you're right about Harriet, because I have beta readers that sit on my shoulders, and Ellen would tell me to do this and Rebecca would tell me to do that, you know, and that influence starts to creep in as you get better and better. And so I think reading a long series and watching the language evolve, watching the writing get tighter, watching the nuance get deeper, watching a word, instead of having one meaning, it has 3, because you think back to the 3 other times it was used. As a writer, that's a game I play as a reader. So I was a literature major, so I learned to read analytically. I was a writer, so I learned to read as a writer, and then I had to learn to read as an editor. So you can come at a story in multiple ways, and when you understand those layers from all those different angles, you get to witness that language in action. And the fact that Jordan was somebody who appreciated language, appreciated word use, appreciated the rhythm of language and the musicality of it, without it being overbearing, I think is really attractive to me in the way the story is written. And I like the risks he took that kind of stepped outside of traditional fantasy roles. I think it's in, I'm having a day. So I think it's in book 2 where they go into my brain is not working. They go through the pillars, not the ways, but the
portal stones.
Thank you, the portal stones. And because it's Rand's power that's channeling it, they're flipping through all the different times. And Tolkien's he's using the word flicker, and it's flicker, 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 flicker. That is not something you see in classic fantasy. And yet it pushes you into the fact that this is a different place, that something else is going on here, that there are layers beyond that, not only in what's happening in that scene, but in the language that's used to describe it. So you're working on different levels. That scene to me really kicked in how many different layers this story was going to contain, because just the use of that word and the energy of it and the speed of it was different than what I was used to seeing. And I think that was really powerful for me in watching his bravery in that choice, knowing this was going to lead somewhere new.
Sargon, how about you? What about the language?
I think Paige was spot on. And I agree wholeheartedly with all of that. So I have this moment in my mind of, and I remember where I was the first time I had a conversation with someone who I had no idea who read Wheel of Time. And they said something to me, and the phrase was, "The golden crane flies for Tarmangaiden." And I started getting teary-eyed. I was in a karate dojo in a changing room, and someone said this to me in some weird conversation. We were having a conversation about, I don't know what we were talking about, but fantasy and writing, and that came up. And it was just when, I always forget, Knife of Dreams? Is it Knife of Dreams?
That's
Knife of Dreams comes out, and I'm just blown away by this one phrase, right? This one phrase is just so powerful. And yet that one phrase, he could have thrown that in 6 paragraphs before he threw it in. He put it in at the end, obviously, for that dramatic effect. But it was actually the parts before it that moved me even more. And the moment where Nynaeve is talking to these 3 men who have left who they were. They have no concept, or I shouldn't say no concept, but they have very little concept of what it's like to be a Malkyria anymore, right? It's not part of who they are. They've sort of changed. They've drifted away from who they were. They've shifted their ideas, their identity, possibly to survive, possibly because it's less painful for a variety of reasons. That I think all of that flavor comes out in the writing. And that moment where, one of the characters starts shaking, right? And he doesn't know if he's shaking with laughter, or is it madness, or is he crying? And he's unsure of all of these different things that are happening to him. And I think it's because you can feel that happening to you as well at that moment. You're going through all these emotions. You're laughing, you're crying, because you have a feeling that something like this might be coming. But again, it's not something it's not smacking you in the face constantly, right? That's not what Jordan was trying to do. It was there subtly. You had a sense of it, but the way in which he utilized the language really allowed your emotions to connect with it, I felt, at that exact moment. And that, to me, was what made it so powerful. That phrase, extremely powerful. Those 3 paragraphs, 2 to 3 paragraphs that build up to it, just those, they give me goosebumps every single time I read it. Doesn't matter when it happens. It's the same thing over and over again, because my emotions go exactly with the emotions of the characters at that moment. And I think that, what more could you ask for as a writer? That's so powerful.
There's something I want to speak to when Paige was talking about how he was able to do, just a beautiful rhythm and cadence. It reminded me of JordanCon 1. It was Saturday evening-ish, or early evening, before we broke for dinner. And they had a special event that they played one of the recordings that Robert Jordan made in his final days, as they were capturing as much as they could of the of notes and what he hadn't had a chance to make notes of. And so they did a lot of audio recordings. And they played a segment that was pretty close in language to what became the opening of The Gathering Storm, the first scene in The Gathering Storm's prologue. And yeah, it had already been a day and a half of us being together, and just all the emotions of all these Wheel of Time fans getting together after his passing. And as we get into this room, you could have heard a fucking needle drop. And it still gives me goosebumps to think of just hearing his voice with the cadence as he's talking about the silver and black clouds rolling in and rolling back and rolling in and rolling back. And this farmer's observation of this, and the people coming by telling him to break down his plow and turn it into a forge, or turn it into a blade, because the last battle is coming. It is just really powerful in that point. And it's actually gotten to the point that I almost can't read The Gathering Storm because I can't recapture that magic anymore. So it just gets to live on in my memory.
Well, and Michael, this will be an easy one for you. So when I first picked up the books, one of the things that grabbed me the most, and this comes from a lot of the study I've done, in terms of anthropology, magics, religions, cultural studies, and things like that. And that was one of the things that grabbed me the most when I picked up this series, was looking at influences, looking at things that hinted at different belief systems, and the way that it shaped the characters. It was really the way of looking at, and this is still one of my lifelong fascinations, why people believe what they believe. And this is one of the things that out of the series that captured the most for me, is looking at the different characters and looking at the belief systems and what they believe, why they believe them, what influences and drives them, because that's part of what makes them so real to me in looking at this and looking at those influences. So for you, how much do those belief systems, the political belief systems, the religious belief systems, all of those different facets, what does that do for you in this world?
Okay.
I told you it was the easy one.
It is. But what can I say about it? So again, it goes back to that layer cake, right? And that understanding one of those layers is him. Like one of those layers is James Oliver Rigney Jr., Robert Jordan, his life experience, what he had seen, what he had done. He's in there, and so when you're looking at these sort of connections to belief systems, as you said, part of that is we're seeing that belief system through Jordan's own eyes. And so it's a way of actually getting closer to him to understand how he's seeing that, right? And why he's seeing it that way. And it also is one of the things that I think makes the text speak more clearly to us, because he was a man of his own time, and we're at least closer to that time than we are to Tolkien's. So you're seeing other cultures, other religions in a way that is at least more familiar to us. And of course, it's a much bigger canvas because he's using everything, as opposed to, Tolkien was, people say he was just Northern Europe. That's not true. I've published about his use of Homer and things like that, but it is still kind of a quote unquote Western civilization sort of background that he's using. Tolkien, was somewhat limited by that. Jordan blows all that up, and so you're getting a much bigger canvas, and you're getting the canvas of what kind of he understood in his lifetime, and what he understood of the world, which of course reflected his upbringing here in Charleston, South Carolina, his experience in Vietnam, all of these things that he had gone through in his life, and the way that he had lived his life. Those are what is in the book. Like it is of the maker, as it were. And so one of the things I try to sort of deal with this in the Origins of the Wheel Time book coming out, to try and help people understand this, that is remarkable, and is magnificent, and is a way of understanding Jordan better as a writer, as a human being. Even if you didn't have the privilege of knowing him, you can still know him by knowing how he's viewing the world through this text. I think it's kind of a beautiful thing. I would say that the kind of fullness of how that works out is obviously not something I knew when I was reading this, like in middle school. Like that's not something I was capable of understanding. That's something I definitely grew with, because back to something Paige was talking about, that this is a text that develops over time. So how I view religions and faith and those socio-cultural aspects of character is very different now than it was even 5 years ago. It's changed a great deal in how I understand this text. That's kind of a long-winded answer to your question.
So Paige, how about you?
Well, I'm going to go off on a slight tangent. I had the privilege of learning archetypes from an English teacher in high school who taught them to us by rolling in the big silver rolly TV, on the cart, and playing original Star Trek to teach us what archetypes were. Okay. So when I encounter that in a story, there's a deep understanding that there are these themes in Western human culture and even beyond that cross boundaries. And I think for a long time, people were afraid to pull from other places, write what you know, write what you know. How many of us heard that? Write what you know. And the fact that there were things in the Wheel of Time that were stepping beyond that in a way that I hadn't seen a lot of writers do was really fascinating to me. And yet there was a familiarity to the rhythm of that. And it was also I was reading it at a point in my life where I was starting to understand that the small little white bread town that I grew up in was, not how things were everywhere. You know what I mean? And so I think that's the beauty of fantasy in general, is that it takes you beyond yourself. It takes you beyond the reality that you know. And I think that's why I prefer it to literature, which happens like here and now in the world, and I'm already living that, and please, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to be elsewhere. I want to explore more. And so I think that the fearlessness of that approach was different as the books were being written than, again, what I had seen before. I would be really, sometimes I want to take authors and I want to pick them up out of where they started, and I want to bring them like to now, because I'm just like, it fascinates me, the idea of what Wheel of Time would have been had it been started 5 years ago instead of 30 years ago, because how much more accessible are the things that he was working with, how much more accessible are other cultures, are other histories, our access to that, the expansion of the internet, the things that are more accepted in our world, and how much easily you can have conversations with people from all over the world in different places. He would have loved that, from what I know, the access of that, the dream of that, which I'm going to slide around here a little bit, which is why I whatever issues people have with the adaptation of the TV show, I think there's a level of appreciation of that access, of that change, of that modernization that he would actually have appreciated, because, Nynaeve and Egwene are not Targaryen in the books. I think they should have been. And if he wrote it now, they probably would have been, but to have those modernizations, I don't think it's disrespect, because I think, to the original story as Jordan conceived it, because I think that he would have loved it. I think he would have appreciated that reaching out to different cultures and pulling in from different experiences, and that access to different points of view that he was trying to share in his work. And I get a kick out of the TV show for that reason, even though it's way different than the books. I think that spirit exists within it, and I really appreciate that. So I think I went off on a tangent, but there you have it.
Sargon, how about you?
So I would say that Paige, the idea of access is so important. Having that access, what that means to an author, to a writer, especially someone like Robert Jordan, and also to bring in, God, not to go down like that path of epistemology and then ontology and all that crazy stuff, but it does kind of inform. I'm not even kind of, it informs, what you know and how you know what you know, right? And so this is pretty important to all of this. Paige just said that if you think about how writers, we all think about, you write what you know, you're connected to what you know. And so we do write what we know, but we do take chances, and some people take more chances than others. And again, Michael and Richard talked about this, sort of the way in which the culture was used. Michael just used that or expressed it in a way to show that canvas, that Tolkien drew from a smaller canvas in many ways, arguably in a phenomenal way. Not definitely not saying anything negative about Tolkien and what he did, but Robert Jordan utilized, let's say, far more cultural pieces from around the world in many ways than Tolkien did. And what that, I think partly what that does is but it's still through his eyes, right? I mean, he didn't change. It's not like, okay, now he has access to some more knowledge, let's say, from these different cultures, but it's still through his eyes, right? It's through his system, and it's coming out through, and so we're reading it the way in which he is viewing this, right? And then again, we take the way he viewed it, and then of course we all interpret that in a different way too. So sometimes some of us get frustrated with certain things that we see, and others of us are super thrilled by the exact same segment. I think that's what's so fascinating about that. And I'll say that just as a final thing for me, to be able to take various cultures and to create amalgams, I think is very cool. And I think, there sometimes some writers do this and I get frustrated. When Jordan did it, I did not at all. I mean, to take the Aiel and to mesh the Aiel with like a desert dwelling culture. So you get these like feels of the Middle East, but it also feels a little bit like, various First Nations people, but then it also, they look like kind of tall Celtic or Pictish people. And you're like, man, would that even happen in a desert? Well, yeah, kind of, they would, because a lot of places where it's really hot, people tend to cover themselves because they know you burn, and that's not really what you want to do. And so then you scratch your head and go, I don't know, does this work? Does it not work? And, everyone has their different feelings about this. But I loved it because, even in the borderlands, you can have a culture like the Aiel, which are folks that are connected to the borderlanders in a sense, right? Because they have that geographical connection to an extent, at least in some areas with the waste and the borderlands. And then, I love this. I still love, to go back to the first book, that moment where Tolkien keeps, the borderlanders keep just saying peace, 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 peace. And I'm cracking up while they're saying peace because, oh my God, peace, the term itself is used in many different languages in the Middle East as a greeting, right? And as you're leaving, everyone says peace. And that influence of the Middle East. And I have to say, even some of the phrases that he uses that, and I don't want to do it because I'm going to totally mess it up, but Land says something like, he's trying to explain it to the boys. Why do they keep saying peace? And he says, to know something, but not to have it is something like a dream. I'm totally messing it up. But whatever phrase he says there is so interesting to the history of the Middle East if you study it, or if you live those cultures. And there's just this moment where I was like fascinated by his usage of that. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And for me to be pulled into it that way, I wasn't offended by it. I didn't think it was problematic. I thought, wow, he's touching on some things here that I didn't realize I didn't see, right? And I teach Middle East studies, and I wasn't seeing necessarily some of this, but maybe he was. And I'm not saying I know that. Even if I could say that I did know that, I wouldn't say that because we have people on this panel who can't say certain things. So I have to make sure that I have to, but I have no idea, right? I'm just reading into this, but I love the fact that, these pieces pop out. And I keep thinking to myself, like, wow, did he have some secret insight, or did he have some experience that I didn't know about? I'm unaware. I have no idea, but there's something there, right? And I want to know more because of that. One day I'm just gonna, Michael and I have to have a longer conversation. But anyway, that's from months from now.
We'll put it on. Richard, how about you? Huh?
I said, read and find out.
Read and find out.
Read and find out. Yep. Right there. I had in front of me. Read and find out.
So, Richard, any thoughts from you in terms of
as far as like the incorporation of myth and the one thing I really appreciated was the meta concept of story decay that happened throughout that there's the story decay across the ages, that the story that the age turns into legend, the legend into myth, until the original myth is gone by the time the age comes back around. And that happens a lot with information in the world. Everyone has imperfect knowledge because information is constantly decaying as it spreads and the story gets twisted. And that was something I think, I imagine he developed, he gained a very strong appreciation for this in his service to the military. I think he gained a lot of appreciation to this as a nuclear engineer, because he was a nuclear engineer before he was a writer. And I feel like a lot of the overarching pathos and empathy that comes from, as he's drawing on all these different canvases, comes from just the appreciation that everyone is always working with imperfect information. Everyone is always having to make decisions with that shred of doubt in there. That became apparent to me, or I guess that really shone out to me when I was having a conversation with Harriet. That there was just, we were just kind of talking about how, why does the Wheel of Time appeal to so many people across so many walks of life? And it comes down to that common thread that we all have this feeling, down to the Two Rivers kids, can we trust Moraine when we're leaving? How much do we actually trust? We have to make this decision now. What can we do? And it just continues all the way to the very end, to the last battle itself. There's so much unknowns that are having to have, people having to make decisions around. So.
Well, I appreciate everybody coming forth to have a pretty deep dive about the Wheel of Time. Of course, this was not ever going to be a surface conversation, I don't think, because I don't think there's any way to talk about the world of Robert Jordan that way. But before we get out of here, I do have one quick question. And Paige, you sort of started going this way. What do you guys think? For those of you who have seen it, what do you think of the TV interpretation?
I liked it, but I made that obvious. I thought they made some very interesting choices that, initially I was kind of going, I don't know about that. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, okay, well, if you're trying to take 14 books of this complexity and you're distilling for a modern audience, where do you go? How do you make these choices? And I think that they were brave choices. And, I don't agree with everything, but it's not my spin on the Wheel of Time. It's theirs. It's the creators of the show. So, I'm interested to see where it goes. Yeah, I liked it.
Anybody else?
I'll say I very much agree with Paige, especially to her point that I think were Robert Jordan still with us, he would absolutely love the inclusion of people of color, of LGBTQ in the series, of some of the challenging the concept of gender binary that the magic system inherently had. And while there were parts of it that, like Paige, I was like, I'm not sure about that, including the end of season 1. The final episode, it's like I also have to realize that it's just too much to compress down, and with all the added unpleasantness of late in the world that added complexities with shooting, and then also just a lot of realistical things you have to do with accepting that you can't keep a actor on retainer that's not going to show up for 7 series that you introduce in season 1 then isn't going to come back till season 8. You don't waste someone like Rosamund Pike with the original book 2 Moraine thread where she's basically not there. They needed to give her something else. They wanted to do something more interesting and fun. And so I am being cautiously optimistic as they move forward, that I think they're going to keep to the spirit of the Wheel of Time. And I also like the non-canonical, the non-official, this is a different turning of the wheel. It's a different third age. It can be different. We'll hit the major points.
Well, I think we'll let Michael off the hook unless he's got something to say.
Oh, I enjoy it. They really could use a medieval military historian on board. That's all I'm going to say. I might have some suggestions about what makes not a lick of sense. I might have some thoughts in that regard, but the things that some other fans were upset about, I just don't get it. Like, did you read these books? I mean, really? I know you think you did, but really? Because I mean, as Richard and Paige have both said, these the casting changes especially. Yeah, they're great. They're great.
I'm gonna jump ahead of Sargon here and say, I can never again read the books without seeing Zoe as Nynaeve, because she is absolutely perfect, and I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Crap.
And that's the words we leave you on.
No, I will say two things. One, I wholeheartedly agree. I like thinking of it as this is someone else's vision, right? That's simply how you have to look at it. This is someone else's vision. And it has its I think wonderful pieces, and it has its pieces that I'm frustrated about. I wouldn't Can I be very specific and say I wouldn't have done Perrin the way that Perrin was done at the beginning, but I've heard the arguments for why that was done. I'm a big fan of I think what carries the boys through is that they had a really, from what I thought I read in the books, a very good, like wholesome, wonderful upbringing in a sense, right? I think that's kind of what keeps. There's a moment where, well, what does Rand say? I was raised better, right? Like there's that great moment where it's like, I was raised better this time. Like, yeah, no crap. That's extreme. Like that is such a core piece of the text. So, Michael, your comment about having a medieval historian, I don't know. Part of me would be like I wish they would have like a nerd like me on board. I don't know how I would sell myself, but like that moment of Rand saying that, like, oh, hey, hold on, don't do that, don't do that, don't do Perrin like that, you know. But I do think, and I don't know if anyone's going to listen to me, Amazon, Sony, whoever you are. I think it would absolutely help them to have the funding at the level of the Lord of the Rings, because I do think a lot of what ends up happening with the Wheel of Time is that the difficulties, from what I understood, the difficulties they faced was that midst of COVID, but also the budget has been smaller, right, than something like Wheel of Time. So that plays a role in a modern fantasy, again, a modern take on one of the largest or the largest fantasy series, word for word in modern history. You need a lot. I mean, and Robert Jordan was absolutely focused on detail, right? So to show all those details in 8 episodes, oh my God. I mean, how do you do that? I think that's very, very difficult. So no matter what, that's also the part of the problem for me, is that it's so hard for them to measure up. Like, how could I expect 8 episodes to measure up to, the eye of the world? I don't think it's possible, at least again, from my perspective. So I had to cut it and say, this is a totally different perspective, and just leave it at that.
I will say that I still highly respect and love their decision to spend the entire episode on the Warders. The episode, I've heard a lot of people complain about, oh, why'd they waste this whole episode just talking about the Warders and the one that took his own life. And it's like, there's just so much deep world building and great acting and great commentary of just the world that was in that episode, that I'm so glad it was there. I wish they had 2 more episodes for the season, but which they were hoping they were going to have 2, and they didn't.
Richard, that's a great point. There's that point too. I was thinking of the book three, mm-hmm. where they're fighting in the in Tar Valon, and mm-hmm. You get the Matt story with the 2 boys, where he fights the 2 of them off. Mm-hmm. And it was a great moment where you get to see a little bit of the background of the Warders and kind of their training, how they feel about things, how they act and react. And you don't really see a ton of that, even in the book series, but you got more of a glimpse of it, I think, in that episode. That's a great point. Yeah. I really appreciated seeing a little bit more of their world as well. And that's the nice thing, is they can go into those parts of the story that, they just didn't come into the book for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. Well, guys, yeah. I appreciate. Oh, go ahead, Paige.
Oh, I was just going to say that episode, to me, I think spoke to some of the things that were lacking with the boys. It spoke to that male camaraderie that you kind of get in the early part of episode 1, and then it kind of gets broken up by the changes that they made, especially with Matt and Perrin. But I think that's the thing. One of the things I really liked about the way they did the TV show is the male characters, especially as portrayed in that episode, are, quite frankly, they're badass, but they're deeply caring about each other in a way that you don't see a lot of on in fantasy television, because there's this, there's a whole lot of macho guys. There's a whole lot of macho. And I really appreciated them breaking that stereotype that gets tossed into fantasy, where you're the brave hero, and you only have so much caring for the person beside you because you must be strong, and I really liked that they took the time with that. I think it's going to set up some really, really interesting possibilities for the future of the show. And I think it was a risk worth taking. So yeah, I'm with Richard on that one. I liked it.
And Daniel Hetty is that's his last name, right? Yeah, is land for me from now on.
Well, guys, I know we've gone a little long, but I appreciate you taking all the time tonight to come in and talk about this and take a nice deep dive. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. So, Paige?
I am Paige L, Christie everywhere. You got to put the L in. I have 2 first names, and God knows what you end up with if you don't put the L. But yeah, PaigeLChristie.com takes you to everywhere on social media, but that's where you can find me. And I think my next live appearance in 2022 will be at Multiverse Con in Atlanta in October. So come hang out.
Sargon?
So SargonDonabed.com. I don't remember the last time I really spent time updating my website, but you can find me. I teach at Roger Williams University. I have a webpage up there as well. And yeah, my sdonabed at rw.edu, I think is the email, and or through the website, probably the easiest way is to contact me. And yeah, probably Multiverse as well, I think. Around, yeah.
We just announced you as of this recording, so I hope so.
Richard?
So richardfife.com is my website. I actually do update it pretty regularly. As of this recording, my next appearance is going to be Congregate, although by the time this is airing, I am going to be at, I'm just going to be attending WorldCon, ChiCon 8. I'll also then be at Multiverse, since I helped run it.
Michael?
MichaelLivingston.com. I'm on Twitter at Medieval Guy. And yeah, I tend to get around. I'm not going to be at Multiverse. Apparently, I've just dropped the ball on that. So my bad. Unlike all these other cool people. But yeah, MichaelLivingston.com, probably the easiest way to get a hold of me.
And I've had the pleasure of being your host tonight, Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, the Speculative Fiction Academy, and of course here at ConTinual. And I'll be at Congregate this coming weekend. Of course, by the time this airs, that'll have been done. I will be at Raleigh SuperCon, and then I'm at DragonCon, and I'll get to be at Multiverse as well. Somebody left the back door open. I'm not sure how that happened again. But I want to thank everybody for joining us for this evening, and we will see everybody again soon.